Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and self-publishing. And today we are very delighted to have a guest from Craig's part of the world, from all the way from Ontario, to Randi-Lee Bowslaugh, who is a writer, a speaker, an advocate, and you are here today to talk to us about the thought that needs to go into writing a book before you write the book, which I think is quite an interesting and prescient topic. So, Randy, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I am pretty good. Even though it's dreary outside, I'm doing pretty good.
Oh, well, I'm very happy to hear that. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland. Welcome, Randi-Lee. Yeah, it is dreary outside. I can vouch for that in this part of the world for sure. So yeah, one of the things we haven't really talked a lot about on the podcast is nonfiction. And I know that you write a variety of things, but nonfiction is the primary thing primary genre that you write in. And so, I thought we would focus today on that and the idea of figuring out what it is you're going to write, understanding the purpose of your book, who your audience is, all of that stuff, because I think people that are used to genre writing maybe don't know some of that stuff, or don't have an idea of how to even really get started. I mean, a lot of us, I know that Roland primarily writes genre, romance and stuff like that, but he's also written a couple nonfiction books, one on intermittent fasting, whatever. So sometimes there's authors that will want to branch out into nonfiction, and it seems like such a different beast that they might be sort of wondering, what the differences are around that. And so hopefully we can talk about some of that and figuring out the direction before you get started, which seems like probably something that we want to do, but maybe not. You'll tell us. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you write, and then we'll
Sure. So, well, I'm in Canada and I have 2 kids, a grandkid, some cats, some dogs, a husband. I always put him at the bottom of the list. I think it's really funny. And I got into writing. Well, I mean, I've been writing my whole life, but I published my first book back in 2017. And I was like, I always said, I'm going to write a book. Found all these poems that I had written as a teenager, put them into my book. And I was like, hey, there, I've written a book. And then I was like, I like doing that. So I just kept going. And yeah, nonfiction seems to be kind of where my heart is at. But I definitely have branched out, like you said, into some other genres. I've done some scary story stuff and some kids books. I like to sprinkle those in because nonfiction is hard to write. It's a very heavy topic.
Well, it depends on the topic, right? So what are the topics that you usually cover? I assume that, for most people like Roland did, you would pick a topic that you're really familiar with, that's really important to you, because that is one that you'd be, most knowledgeable already. Maybe you have to do less research, although I'm sure there's a lot more research involved in nonfiction than fiction. But yeah, so, what do you typically write for nonfiction, and how do you pick your topics?
Mental health. So like I said, it's a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah.
So you said it. You pick a topic that you are well versed in, that you're very familiar with. And so I've been dealing with mental health, my own struggles, family struggles, parenting struggles, all around mental health forever. So it really made the most sense to talk about that topic. So there is a lot of pre-planning. I mean, first you have to live through it. But then but then you got to figure out what pieces that you're willing to share and which ones you're like, oh, maybe the world doesn't need to know that.
Yeah, and I think with certain topics like that, there are sort of those questions about, how much you want to share, whereas with something that isn't as personal, like I'm sure with intermittent fasting, there's probably very little that Roland didn't really want to share. Maybe he didn't want to talk about like his starting weight and ending weight, but other than that, I don't know what else there would be.
Yeah, for the most part, I like to say I'm an open book. I have not taken out too many things. I pretty much try to be as open and transparent with my books because first off, it helps me just in life. Writing is very cathartic. And when you're writing nonfiction, it's that much more cathartic because you are literally shedding out all of that bad stuff. But when it comes to the emotional side, I think that's the part that sometimes I don't necessarily specifically leave out, but I try to put a more positive spin on. So for example, my last nonfiction book that came out earlier this year, it was about my brother's death by a drug overdose. And the first draft was filled with such rage and anger at him that I was like, oh, this is not a good book right now. So I do touch on the fact that I was angry at him in the book, but by the final draft, it was still a more positive book than it started as.
How many drafts did you go through, if you don't mind me saying, from your first book to your finished product?
I didn't count. I'm gonna say like real true drafts, because sometimes, since it was such a hard topic, sometimes I'd only be able to write for like 15 minutes and then I'd be like, hey, I'm done, I'm crying. So I'm not gonna say those were drafts or even real well work. I'm gonna say true drafts, maybe 5.
Oh, Roland, you're on mute, I think, or I'm
Yep.
not hearing. Nice.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that's quite a lot, actually. That's quite a lot of work to write your book and then kind of rewrite it 5 times.
Yeah, again, it was that emotional aspect with that one. But I think that the final draft, like the final copy, really came across exactly how I wanted it to.
Right. So how would you, I mean, I guess, so with nonfiction, you know, I would imagine you kind of want to do a little bit of market research before you start to make sure that there's an audience big enough for your topic. I mean, sure, writing is cathartic and there's value in writing it regardless of whether anyone reads it, and you know, that's a thing too. But if you're looking to maximize, you know, the commercial success, and there's not a specific topic that you necessarily are like, I need to write this one, you probably want to research a little bit to see, you know, is there a market for what I'm writing? You know, sometimes you can jump on trends. I'm not saying that, you know, when Roland wrote his intermittent fasting was trending then I don't know if it was. I know, you know, it has its ups and downs, right? So if you can capitalize on when it's popular, but that's not always as obvious, right? So I think there's probably some sort of research that goes into it before you get started. Is that
maybe for some people? I'll fully admit I don't do that, but it's because the topic is so near and dear to my heart that honestly, if only one person reads the book and actually takes some kind of value out of it, like it actually helps them, because I'm writing about mental health. So if only one person finds some kind of useful tool out of it, I feel like I've been successful with that book. I've definitely had a lot more people read them than just one, which is awesome. But when it comes to the topics that I'm choosing to write about, I don't do the market research first. However, I mean, you can look in the news and very easily see that mental health is a trending topic. It is something that needs to be discussed. Drugs, like the last one about drugs, is such a huge topic, and you know, the opioid crisis and leading to homelessness and all of these different things. I feel like I didn't necessarily have to do a heck of a lot of market research anyways, because I can just open my Facebook and there's a million stories about those topics.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like I said, like when you wrote it, yours is sort of like that other case where it's like you don't care necessarily about, you know, you just want to help, even if it's a few. And I think any book you're going to write, there's always going to be some audience for it. It's just a matter of whether or not, you know, you're looking to, you know, make a career out of writing nonfiction. Then you're probably going to want to go for some of the ones that are more popular, you know, that have a bigger potential audience than others. Not saying mental health isn't one of them. I have no idea, right? But like, you know, if you write something that's super specific and niche, you might have a harder time finding, your readers.
Oh, 100%. So the second book that I wrote is actually about raising my kid with autism. So yes, there are tons of families out there that have autism in it. They're dealing with it. There's teachers out there, right? Like there is a wide audience for it. However, it is still a much more niche and specific topic than mental health. Mental health, even though my book, like one is about my depression, the other about drug addiction, even though they have specific mental health diagnoses that I'm talking about, you can really read them for any mental health kind of issue. So it's a much wider topic than talking about parenting and parenting a kid with autism.
Right. Yeah, it is a much broader topic for sure. And I think, it depends too. Like if you're going to write something like about, giving financial advice or something, that has a really broad base as well. Everyone needs to understand money and wants to learn how to maximize it and invest well and whatever. So, there's obviously there's like a huge market. And then, if you specialize and be like, okay, this one's specifically about, investing in your in your retirement plan, and this one specifically on saving for your kids going to college, you can niche it out that way too, right? So when you're writing your books, are you thinking at all about the audience and the purpose?
So that is pretty much the only thing that I think about pre-writing the book. So just before we were recording, Roland had said, oh, pantser plotter kind of came up as a topic, and I'm a pantser. However, in order to really find the direction of the book, even though I'm a pantser, I'm not plotting out the whole thing, I'm not deciding what chapter is going to be what ahead of time, I still need to figure out who it is that I'm writing for and why I am writing that book. Because with it being such a big topic and such a big part of my life, I've been able to write more than one book on mental health. But if I wouldn't have had a specific purpose for each book, then I wouldn't have been able to go, okay, this book specifically is for, teenagers trying to just get through a crisis in their life. This book here is somebody who is prepared to make some changes. This one here is for the family members. So finding out who exactly it is that I'm speaking to. So I do very conversational writing. So who it is I'm speaking to through my writing, that helps me to then direct how I'm wording things, what kind of language I'm going to actually use in the book, as well as making sure that I am staying on track for what the message of that book is. So going back to the one I was just talking about, the one about my brother, it's called Goodbye Too Soon. And there's lots of books out there about addiction. They are sometimes written by somebody who has had an addiction, and so they're writing to other people who are in their addiction. My book is specifically written to the family members. So knowing who it is that I'm talking to made it a lot easier as I'm writing, as I'm going through. And there was some research, like say the risk factors. As I'm talking about the risk factors, making sure that I'm not saying to the family members, especially my book, because my mom read it. And so at some points it's like childhood trauma plays a big role in whether or not somebody develops an addiction, but making sure going consciously in my head, okay, if my mom was to read this, just like any mom was to read this book, I'm not saying you did something wrong. You did the best you could with the tools that you had, but this is just a risk factor. So understanding your audience plays a huge role in what you're saying.
Yeah, I think you don't want to have your mom read that and then she needs to go to therapy because she feels like she's ruined your life.
Right? She got that vibe off my first book. Well, actually, so my first book that came out in 2017, it's poetry that I had written as a teenager when I was super depressed at the time. So it's very, very dark. Not a heck of a lot of context in it because it's a book of poetry. And so when my mom was describing it to my dad, and they aren't together, I don't talk to my dad too much, but he just happened to be where we were at the time. And my mom said, yeah, it's a book about how we're horrible parents. And I was like, oh, that was not my intention at all. So understand who it is you're talking to so that you can use the correct language is so important.
Yeah, I can imagine that a lot of parents are going to read those and automatically take that sort of idea, no matter how carefully you write it, right? You know?
Right there, there's always going to be somebody who reads it and goes, "Oh my goodness, you said I did it wrong," even though it very clearly states in the next line, "If you didn't know this, how could you have changed it?"
Yeah. I think you can't take things too personally, but I guess as parents, you know, being a parent is you're just racked with guilt about how you're worried you're going to be letting your kids down. And every parent does their best job normally. But
yeah, I always like to say you do the best you can with the knowledge you have at that time.
Right, exactly. So I guess even when you know the topic, you know, I feel like nonfiction is, you have to be much more careful to get your facts right. So I imagine you have to do a lot more research than you would in genre fiction. I mean, even somebody who's writing, you know, a historical book, fiction book, there's, you know, they often want to get a lot of the things right, but there's also more latitude in, you know, the fact that it's fiction. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's not as important if you mess up a few of the facts. Whereas with, you know, a book like mental health or finance or investment, like you want to make sure that you're getting your facts right.
Yeah, so I definitely did quite a bit of research in all of my books, but I like to talk about my most recent one, obviously. But in that one, I wanted to, because I was talking to the family members, again, it goes back to knowing the audience to know what facts to put in. But knowing that I'm talking to the family members, and a big part of it was letting them know that they did nothing wrong and that they can't forcibly change someone. Again, purpose. It all comes back to audience and purpose. But knowing those things, I was able to go, okay, I want to research and put in here the definition of what an addiction is. And not just slap it in there, but I want to have a discussion about it. So I did put in there right from the DSM-5 and explained what that was, which is the diagnostical criteria used to make a diagnosis for somebody. And so really dive into what does that mean? And then I related it back to my brother so that people could understand why it was in the book and how it kind of works. The same thing with risk factors. I mean, you can go on if you just Google risk factors for addiction, there's tons and tons of websites out there. So sifting through and finding reliable and credible ones is so important. So I really love WebMD. That's an awesome one. Oh my gosh, my brain just went blank of the other ones. But there's certain ones, right, that you know are just way better than other ones. I can see the picture of the website. It's got a blue background. I don't funny how our brains work, but knowing, you know, fact checking, I'm not just going to the one website, I'm going to more than one to make sure that what I'm saying is true. And then I list all my resources in the back, right? So everybody, you can go back. Obviously, the information is true at the time of publishing because websites can always be updated. But you got to take that with a little bit of grain of salt as things update. But yeah, making sure that you fact check not just on one website, but on multiple, and ones that you know are credible and reliable. You're not just going to, you know, Joe Blow's blog, which unless you're talking about a random thing and that makes sense for your book, making sure that it's people that, you know, doctors are actually writing this information or financial advisors are actually writing this information. So you know that there is a knowledgeable base behind it.
Yeah, you definitely want reputable sources.
And I think that's one of the challenges you face as a self-published author writing non-fiction, is because, you know, people can write anything about anything, and it's important to have that actual credible information behind it.
Yeah. Mayo Clinic. That's the other one I love. Sorry, I knew it would pop into my head.
I mean, I think too, like often you'll find that the people that write the nonfiction are, you know, experts in the field. Often you'll see they're doctors or, you know, professionals that know about it. So often that gives some credibility to it as well. In terms of, you know, you made a good point about the fact that, you know, the knowledge that you impart is factual at the time, but things change, new research comes out, things get revised. Do you end up, have you ever, or do you have a strategy for revising your nonfiction books from time to time?
So at this point, I haven't. But as far as I know, there also hasn't been any major breaks in things that I've written that would have made a big change. I am wanting to revise my poetry book, and mainly that's because when my mom said that, and even though she said it years ago and I still haven't revised it, it's still on the top of my head to do though. Uh, I've realized now, I'm not speaking to the audience correctly. I feel like I need to put a little bit more maybe context before all the really, really dark poems, just to give some context and a little bit more light to the book. But it wasn't because research-wise anything has changed quite yet. Even with the book about my kid, there might be a few differences now with autism. What I'm doing with that one is I'm actually almost finished living through the teenage years. So book 2 will be out, and that will kind of be how it gets revised, is that now that we are older and have learned new things and more research has come out, you'll notice from book 1 to book 2 and that kind of thing. So that's how I'm going to work that one. But if there is any major changes, say in 5 years when it comes to addiction, I might go back and say, hey, this is some new information we didn't have at the time. This is important to know.
Yeah, and it gives you an easy way to, refresh the book and sell a revised version, right? It's like textbooks. Every year they change so that you can resell them.
I know. I remember in college, I had to use the criminal code, and my husband had used it the year before, so I just used his. I think like one line in the whole stinking thing was changed, and they're telling us we have to buy new ones. I was like, no, not doing
And they're not cheap, are they?
No, they're like $100 a pop.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we're talking about purpose, right? The purpose of your book, is there a good way to figure that out, like a trick to use, rule of thumb for people to figure out the purpose of?
My trick is to follow what I feel in my heart, which sounds so cheesy and corny as I'm saying it out loud, but that's what it is. So when I actually started writing Embracing Me, so that came out 2021. This is a good example for this question. So when I started Embracing Me, I knew it was going to be about mental health. I knew it was going to be about my depression. I really wanted to talk about medication and therapy and that kind of thing in it. But as I started to write it, it didn't feel right. Like it didn't feel like it was having a purpose. It felt very like I'm writing a diary and it's just not going anywhere, that first draft. As I got in, I didn't just throw it away though, because I was like, hey, something will come from this, because I know this is what I need to do. I just can't figure out the purpose. So as I was writing it, there was a point where something just kind of clicked in my brain. And I realized that the purpose of that book needed to be to let others know that it was okay to have a mental health issue, and that you could still be awesome, and you can embrace, that's where I came up with the name, you can embrace all parts of yourself. So sometimes for me, it's just a matter of starting with an idea, and then eventually a purpose will click. I had to go back and rewrite the first 3 chapters, but totally worth it. Because as soon as that clicked, and as soon as that concept of embracing every aspect of who you are came into my mind, I was like, I know this book will be great. I was passionate about it. The writing for it became so much easier because I understood why I was writing it. So I think it really is, when it comes to things like mental health or like your story. I've read a lot of nonfiction where it's people sharing their stories, whether it be about mental health, or I just read a near-death experience one. Once you figure out that it feels right to you, then you just know. I know. I wish there was a better answer, a more tangible answer.
Roland, I think you're on mute again.
That makes sense, though. I mean, it is a case of like you feel it and you're like, oh, that's right. And if it doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. Your gut does have quite good guidance, I think.
I'm glad you get what I'm going for.
And listen, I mean, from a practical point of view, I think in general, if you write a nonfiction book that's too broad and too generalized, not only will it not really meet the needs of anyone. I mean, I guess it could be sort of like a primer to the overall topic, but if you separate things into smaller purposes, then you can get more sort of books out of it. You're writing more because you're focusing on this person and this person and this person, and a lot of times maybe one book won't be depending on the topic, one book might not appeal to the same, or all those books might not appeal to the same person.
Yeah.
But there might be other people in their lives that the next book will appeal to. So if you're writing them for, the parents of the person, they would have that. And then if you're writing for the person themselves that has the mental health issues, they would want that. And if you're writing it for, friends of the people that have it, and they would want that. And then those people will all be like, hey, you should read this, and you should read that, right? So even if they're not buying it themselves. So I guess, like I said, from a practical point of view, it might make sense to separate it out that way as well.
Definitely. I love getting exactly what I want when I read a book. Like, so I do a ton of book reviews, and some of the ones that I've read, they are so broad that I'm just like, this is a lot. And it's not helpful because it's just too much of it. But I like directness, and I also like things that aren't too long, especially when they're heavy topics. I don't want to read a 400-page super heavy topic on mental health. That's just a lot. So I tend to keep mine fairly short, 150 pages or less, usually around 100. But it's making sure, again, knowing the audience, knowing that it is a heavy topic and can be very difficult to pick back up if you put it down, because I have definitely had people say I'm crying as I'm reading this, which I love those reviews because I'm like, yes, I succeeded. But knowing that if I pick this book up again, I'm going to have tears, I need to make sure that it's a book that maybe you can't read it in one sitting, but you don't need a long time to read it so that you can get what you need out of it. And again, that comes back to purpose.
I think that's wonderful advice. I think everyone listening, if there's one thing to take away, it's like, brevity is the soul of wit, as Shakespeare said. People these days, you're not just trying to make them buy your book, you're also trying to make them invest the time to read your book. And I think a lot of books are very thick. I remember working with one guy who was a lawyer, and he wrote a nonfiction book about how to solve this particular problem. And he had like the answer to all 50 states in one book. And I'm like, what you should do maybe is split it into 50 books, each one about how to solve this problem in that state, because then it would be tiny, it would be cheaper, but it would be relevant. And every book was solving someone's problem. So people were far more likely to be like, how can I file for an LLC in New Jersey than how can I file for an LLC? Here's a book which tells you how to do it in every state.
Yeah, exactly. We don't, as a consumer, like I said, I read lots of books. You guys probably do too. As a consumer, I don't want to have to flip through and look for the information I'm looking for. I want to buy the book that already has it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's it. Non-fiction, I think people overlook it. Non-fiction books are generally bought to solve a problem or because you're interested. It's like you buy a biography of Winston Churchill because you're interested in Winston Churchill, but you buy a book about intermittent fasting because you want to lose weight without having to stop drinking beer. And it's like, that's, having that purpose in the book baked into it, I think is so important and so overlooked.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I love this topic, right? Of finding the purpose, because if you don't know the purpose of the book, your book tends to come out way lengthier. And I remember, way back in high school, but I remember one thing that really stuck out of me. I took this creative writing course in grade 12, and there's not much about high school, I remember, because I skipped so much, but this one course stuck with me because it was, if you can say it in 3 words, why are you saying it in 10?
Absolutely.
But in school, I mean, they almost teach the opposite, right? They're like, give me an essay of 1,000 words. And then you're like, I only have 3 words about this topic. So now I got to extend it out to 1,000.
Yes.
My kid's always complaining about that, right? I have to write so many words. And I'm like, I could do it. I'm wordy. But, I remember back in school, always trying to extend it. And, longer and longer. And it's almost like they should be teaching the opposite. They should be like, get your point across in as few words as possible, because that's the skill people need.
Exactly. When you're in the workplace, right, I have never had an employer tell me, you need to talk longer on this topic, or I want more written on this menu board that only has this much space, right? No, they want short, sweet, straight to the point, make sure that you hit all of the important things that they need to know, and then move on. So yeah, school is definitely not teaching to worldly skills in that regard. They are teaching how to BS, really, to fluff things up. And once you become an adult, I mean, we don't want the fluff, we want the facts. Now, if I am reading a fiction book, I still don't want that much fluff. Like, personally, I like books where the dialogue really takes the lead in the story, and there's not a lot of background stuff, which to me is all the fluff, just enough so I can know where the characters are going. But there's a little bit of place for fluff in fiction, but for the most part, I mean, if you can say it in 3 words, why are you using 10?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess you don't read a lot of fantasy. They tend to.
I do, and I literally skip paragraphs when they are just describing landscapes, because it's boring to me. My brain can't visualize it. I know some people's can better than mine, but I will literally just skip a paragraph and go, okay, well, you're just talking about how green the grass is right now for 6 lines. I don't care how green the grass is.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the writer. Like, I had that problem with Lord of the Rings. Like, I really had a big problem getting through the 3 books in Lord of the Rings. I found it very, very dry and boring in terms of this. I love the movies. I like the story in general, but like, it was a tough read for me. And it took me, I think in university I started and gave up, and then I had to come back to it later in life. Whereas, George R.R. Martin, his books, they're super long as well, but I was very happy to read those, and I found they were much easier to read. So I think, it also depends on,
I think tastes have changed as well.
Yes.
You read a lot of older books, and sometimes there are the writers who've really stood the test of time, like Ernest Hemingway, Jane Austen. They tended to write short books, short sentences, punchy. And like these days, the average composition of a book is so much more succinct. I was thinking, I enjoy reading like Lee Child, and Lee Child is famous for having like very short sentences, punchy, keeps the story going along. Whereas fantasy books, I think they appeal to people who like longer things, and they were written such a long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, even newer ones, they're still usually much bigger. But I think it's also, you're with fantasy, you're in this whole different world that you can't just rely on people's knowledge of this thing in our world.
Yes.
And they already know what that is, and so you have to maybe describe things a lot more. But
it's true. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. What's it called? Oh, so I'm looking at my bookshelf. So earlier this year, I read Locked Out of Heaven. I cannot from this distance see the author's name, but the book itself was good. I really enjoyed the storyline, but there was a lot of that describing and fluff in there as well, which is why I had to take away a star when I did the review. Really good book still. Loved the, kind of like you said, Lord of the Rings. Really loved the story, but there was so much of that other stuff. And it's a fantasy book. But then I've been reading the Warminster series by J.V. Hilliard, and I just finished the 3rd one, and I'm like, hey, when's the next one coming out? Because it's much more fast paced, because there's much more character development and character dialogue, not as much scene setting as others. So every author's a little bit different. And once you find an author you really like, then tell them to write more books. But yeah, everybody has their own style.
Yeah, and I guess it's not really something we have to worry about with nonfiction, because you're pretty much just sticking to the facts. I guess it's just a matter of how detailed you want to go into those facts. But, often you'll give anecdotes and, character study kind of stuff where you're talking about specific cases, which ends up, being sort of, I guess, the fluff of a nonfiction.
Yeah. There can definitely still be fluff in nonfiction. I've read some where, a case study is great. 5 case studies, that's a little tedious, right?
Yeah.
When it's the same outcome, right? Like if it's one case study per chapter, because each chapter is looking at something different, awesome, fantastic, we're putting it all together. But again, when we're looking at 5 case studies on the same thing, same outcome, it just gets to be a lot. And I think, I mean, you guys have said it, in this day and age, people want to know that they're investing their time in something that they can take away from. And that's what it is people are really much more conscientious of what they're spending their time on.
Yeah. Was it Tim Ferriss who said attention is a new currency? Because
I
that's,
like that.
and we're getting trained with our TikToks and our YouTube shorts and stuff like that. It's we like to have what we need downloaded quickly and instantly.
Yeah. I try to tell my kids about like dial-up internet and, have patience back in the day. And there just isn't any patience anymore when it comes to things, right? They want it immediately. They want to get right into the story. Right. So it's the same. My kids still love, my youngest one, he still loves reading 17, and he reads tons of fan fiction because, I mean, it's what he likes. But again, they're getting right into the story and they're short.
Yes. Fan fiction. I'm a big proponent of fan fiction because what they do, it's so clever, is you have characters who you already know and are familiar with, and then that means you can cut out all of the characterization and go straight down to whatever it is you want them to feel. I call it like emotional pornography. I think it's a really good way to learn how to write in a lot of ways. We've moved quite on from non-fiction though, haven't we? We should probably drag it back onto the topic.
Sorry, I'm really good at tangents.
Oh no, so are we. That's a problem. But in terms of non-fiction, right, you come up with a germ of an idea, and how much of before you start writing is thinking about what is the audience going to be like before you write it for them. We had a guest last week or the week before last talking about personal branding and customer experience, and it's kind of interesting to see the parallels here where it's like, you are writing a book that's a non-fiction book that delivers something for somebody. How do you go about, before you put pen to paper, like figuring out who the people who are going to read this book are and what they want out of it?
I don't always. So I do try, but I don't always. So sometimes as I'm writing, it's not until the 2nd or 3rd chapter that I go, this is what. So when I was talking about embracing me, it wasn't until the 3rd chapter that I go, this is the actual purpose of this book. Had to go back and rewrite it, because I feel like you need to know the purpose before the audience, because once you know the purpose, you know who you're speaking to, and so that can be tricky at times. So me and my friend, we've been throwing back and forth this idea. I know the title of the book. It's going to be called In the Mirror, and it's going to be about body image. And so we're throwing back these ideas back and forth, because I'm like, body image, that's a huge topic. But what is our actual purpose behind it? So we've been narrowing it down, niching it down to have a specific topic, to have a specific purpose. And that way we can talk to that specific audience on that purpose. So I do think that, at least for my kind of routine of how I do it, purpose comes before audience, generally speaking.
I like that. That's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So when you write your first book, you've written your first draft of your book, and you said like the one talking about your brother, you had 5 revisions. Like what is the stage that goes through? You write your book, you have your first draft, you start to revise it. Are you revising it for you, or are you revising it for the people you think are going to buy it and read it?
So that one in particular, so I don't normally have that many revisions, like edits, sure, but not that many revisions. This one, just because it was such a particularly hard one to write, because I didn't wait too long after he had died to write it either. I probably started writing it maybe 3 months after he died, so it was still very, very fresh. And so that's why the first draft was angry. Very much anger towards him. The second draft was, a little bit more written to me, working through those anger emotions. And then finally, by the 3rd and 4th draft, I was really writing more towards the audience and then filling in with all the research.
That's interesting. I like that.
Yeah. So if somebody is writing a nonfiction and they haven't done one before, I know you said that you are more of a pantser, but I personally, I mean, in general, I'm more of a plotter, but I would think with nonfiction, it would help to plot more, because you want to figure out all of the things that you want to talk about. Sometimes there's a natural flow to the order they should go in. They're not always, I know in your case, they're more personal, and like almost like telling your story, but they're not always like that. Nonfiction often is more, like, I don't say textbooky, but they're, so what are your thoughts on that sort of idea?
Yeah, so you can have a little bit a combination of both. So with there's a kitty tail. So with this last one, Goodbye Too Soon, I did just kind of start writing it pantser style, right? But then as I was thinking about the audience, thinking about the purpose, I did start sort of plotting it out, going, like you said, there's certain flow of how things need to go together. So once I realized that I'm going to be talking to the families, then I went, okay, what does a family need to know? They need to understand the risk factors. So I would have like a little cheat sheet beside me, and I said, okay, risk factors. Then I'd keep typing, go, oh, you know what else they need to know? They need to understand the diagnostical criteria. Then I keep writing. So once I kind of got through that first chapter, because the first chapter of that book is the day I got the phone call saying he was dead. So there really was no plotting needing to go into that chapter. It really was just my experience with that. And so as I'm writing that chapter and these little things are coming into my head, I would write them all down. Afterwards, I kind of looked at it and go, these are some good ideas for the book. Look at me coming up with great stuff. But then I said, okay, so this needs to come before that, right? I want the diagnostical criteria to come before, the risk factors, or I wanted there's a chapter about our youth criminal justice system, because at the time my brother was going through it, the law had changed, and that kind of played a big role as well. So where does that fit in, and kind of putting it in an order that made sense. So you can do a little combo of both, right? You don't have to sit there and pre-plot the entirety before you start writing. If you're like, I have this great idea, I'm going to go for it. As you're writing, keep notes beside you. Keep some notes. And then when you go back, okay, what makes the most logical sense? Some people like to do it with sticky notes so they can physically move the sticky notes around. I like whiteboards. But yeah, and that way you can actually see where your ideas are and put them in what makes the most sense.
I know this sounds like a plotter, not a pantster.
I said it's a little combo. It's a little combo on that one, because I started pantsing it. As I was pantsing it, then plotting happened. So it was a combo on that one. But some of my other books, like the one about raising my kid with autism, totally pantsered that one. I did not plot that one out. I just went, okay, as a parent, what do you want to hear? This is my story.
Yeah, I think it really probably depends on the type of book, the type of nonfiction, and the sort of the style that you're writing in.
Exactly.
I think, like you said, your style is probably more suited to that. Whereas I think if you're writing a book on, finance, or I don't know, Roland, when you did your intermittent fasting, did you plot out the sort of the chapters and all of the points you wanted to hit?
I have to admit, I was definitely in my pantser stage then, so I didn't. But then I kind of had an idea of what I was trying to put across anyway. And it's it was a case. I think the most challenging thing for me with that book was the conclusion. It's like, hey, I have to explain, hey, you have a problem. This is intermittent fasting. This can solve your problem. This is why it works. This is how you do it. And then conclusion.
Right. And I guess that sort of makes, sense for most nonfiction, is you want to guide people towards an ending that solves the problem, or at least helps them get to their own solution for the problem.
I was going to say, Randy, so what's your background? And did you go to university? Did you study a particular topic or anything like that? Because I will say I studied history at university, which is a case of teaching you how to put together how to suggest a hypothesis and then back it up with facts and evidence, which I find really useful when you're writing something nonfiction. I was wondering if that was, your background, and whether that was something that helped.
So I took pre-community services, which is just like a 1-year kind of course, but then I took corrections. Well, it was called community justice services, but it was really about the correctional system in Ontario specifically. And then I went and did psychology.
Interesting. And psychology is a very appropriate one for this particular topic.
Right. Like I absolutely love psychology. It's so much fun. And then when I was actually out of college, I worked at one of our local Native centers. And through that, we had to take some Native courses. So it was pretty interesting learning a bunch of that. My contract finished before I technically finished the entire program that they had laid out, but I did 4 out of the 8, and it was pretty cool.
That's what psychology is, what my my degree's in as well. So I think, a lot of authors sort of go the route of, learning something else that sort of helps them understand people, and then they end up writing.
I think most writers have, like, empathy is a very strong trait in most writers, especially fiction writers, because you need to be able to see through eyes. And then psychology is a great background for that, because it helps you understand why people do things.
Yeah, I find psychology so very interesting. I just wish in university they didn't make you take all these random courses too. Like I took astronomy at one point because I needed a science or something or some whatever. I'm like, this means nothing, but I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
Makes it more well-rounded, right?
We are approaching the top of the hour. So very quickly, to sort of bring things back to the topic we were talking about, Randy, when people are sitting down planning to write a nonfiction book about something that is important to them, what would you say the 3 most important steps are to think about before you put pen to paper?
Know your purpose.
Yeah.
Your purpose should then lead you to your audience. So then know your audience. And then as you're writing, I know it's before you put pen to paper, but make sure that it feels right.
Yes, feels right. That's great advice. That's going to make coming up with the topic for this podcast much easier as well. I think purpose is kind of, having that purpose behind you. And what is your purpose, would you say, with the next books you're going to write?
So actually the next one that I'm coming up with, I'm plotting it this time because it's actually going to be a suspense. I am deviating away from nonfiction and I am writing a suspense book. So yeah, we'll see how that goes since I'm doing a big 180 and deviating away.
Oh, well, you'll have to keep us posted on that. Craig, before we wrap up, do you have any questions for Randy?
No, I think this was a good sort of primer for the, starting a nonfiction, all the idea behind knowing your audience and your purpose, which I think is, it sounds to me like it's really key to honing in on your topic, making sure that it's going in the right direction. It's going to meet the needs of whoever is supposed to read it, and then allows you to, go back later and write ones that are sort of connected, that, might broaden the audience that the topic is for. And, I think you gave a lot of really interesting points about how to do that, which is, I think, the hardest part for people is to sort of get that in their head. So thanks for coming on and taking us through all that.
Thank you so much for having me.
And where can people find out more about you, Randy? Where can they go?
Yeah, so my website is rbwriting.ca. And then I am on Facebook, RB Writing. I am on YouTube, RB Media. I am on Instagram and TikTok at Randi-Lee Bowslaugh.
Excellent. Well, we'll pop a link down to your website down below. And if you are watching this or listening to this and you decide to scroll down there, show Randy some love. Leave a comment and let her know how valuable you found everything she shared with us has been to you. And also, while you're down there, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that bell notification so you get updated every time we have a new episode. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. So until then, cheerio.